we're going to do kind of a speedy fly through of the last two chapters, and that's kind of bad and it's kind of good. It's good because there's a lot to fit in. It's kind of bad because there's a lot to fit in, but it's kind of good because there's a lot to fit in. There's so much information in these last two chapters. Quite frankly, it's hard to cover in a setting, in a venue like this. Just reading off dates and facts and figures and information honestly gets super hard to follow after a while. I mean, it's super hard for me to put together sitting at a desk, having it all in front of me and still trying to piece it together, let alone try to relay it all verbally to a class like this. But we're going to do our best, and I'll kind of explain how we'll go through it here this morning. And again, you all have it in your Bibles, so if you want to know more in depth, feel free to take your Bible home, open it up at home, and look through it yourself. You are free to do that. It's okay. It really is okay. Daniel chapter 11. We got through the end of last week, and we saw two chapters, chapters 9 and 10, which dealt some with prophecy, but quite honestly, it's a little bit light on prophecy because he focuses on the experience of receiving the prophecy, not so much with vision themselves. The end of chapter 9, we did get the 70 weeks portion, and we went through that. But we talked, especially in chapter 10, he focuses almost entirely on the angel coming to him, or the being coming to him, explaining to him that he will be receiving these things, and how in the background, behind the scenes, what is invisible to all of us are the supernatural fightings and conflicts going on that manifest themselves or make themselves evident through what is going on physically that we do see. Kind of the headline behind the headline. And while we see the human interaction and the battles and the rising and falling of kings and the political plays and all that type of thing, we see a glimpse in chapter 10 of all the spiritual underpinnings, motivations, influences, however you want to call it, that goes on that we often don't even consider. And it's pretty insightful. But then he takes that and he continues on to talk about what will be going on in his future that we know is all influenced by what we see in chapter 10, the spiritual struggles. So chapter 11 contains a lot of prophetic detail about kings and about wars. After the first few verses, which refer again to Alexander the Great, the chapter can be divided into a few different parts, and this is kind of how we'll look at it this morning. The first part, that would be verses 5 through 20, seem to, in my opinion, and according to what I've read, deals mostly with the kings of the south, that is the Ptolemies of Egypt, versus the kings of the north, the Seleucids of Syria. Then in verses 21 through 25, we see it focus in on one king in particular mainly, Antiochus Epiphanes. We talked about him a couple weeks ago. Super bad guy, which in secular history and Greek history and stuff, from what I understand, and again, I'll reiterate, I'm no historical expert here, please correct me if I'm wrong, but from a secular perspective, he wasn't that big of a deal, quite honestly. He wasn't that impressive of a king. He didn't last that long. He wasn't in particularly good standing with Rome at that time, which the Greeks and the Romans were really starting to battle as Rome started to take over the empire. He wasn't that big of a deal. And yet God in his scripture focuses on it quite a bit. I mean, he spends more time on this one king than he did any other Greek king in the era. So again, it makes you wonder why. Well, the why is not too hard to figure out because God has a different perspective than what man often does. And what looks important to us may not be important to God, and vice versa. And so in God's perspective, as relates to Israel and his people and his nation, this one guy caused a lot of damage. And he was a big deal because he caused a lot of death, a lot of heartache, a lot of battle to his people. Plus, he often uses Antiochus as a precursor or a picture of who was to come, who would be even worse for his people, the Antichrist in the future, which is what leads to the next section of the chapter, verses 36 through 45, which seems to focus more on the Antichrist and tribulation. What would be future to us still today? Again, that's a lot of ground to cover, so what we're going to do, what I would like to do, is just take a little sampling of, especially the first section and kind of the second section as well. We're not going to go through every verse. That would take too long, and our brains would explode. But we're going to just take a verse or two, a small passage out of it, and go through it step by step so you can see how it works. And then, like I said, if you want to go home and research on your own, you're welcome to do that. Chapter 11, verse 2, because we kind of lumped in verse 1 with last week's chapter 10. And now I'll show you the truth. Behold, 3 more kings shall arise in Persia. And a fourth shall be far richer than all of them. And when he has become strong through his riches, he shall stir up the kingdom of Greece. And that did happen, by the way. 3 kings went by, and then another king rose up and said, I'm going to attack Greece and conquer them too. But it didn't turn out that way because Greece started winning the battles, and they started beating Persia back. Then a mighty king shall arise, who shall rule with great dominion and do as he wills. As soon as he is risen, his kingdom shall be broken and divided towards the four winds of heaven, but not to his posterity, nor according to the authority with which he ruled, for his kingdom shall be plucked up and go to others besides these. We recognize that pretty easily as Alexander the Great. He rose up. He was a great conqueror. He moved very swiftly. He ruled with great authority. God gave him victory in all of his battles, allowed him to conquer the entire Persian Empire really quickly. Then he died young. He did not, I shouldn't say that. His kingdom didn't go to any of his offspring because they, as I recall, they died as well. But his kingdom went to his generals, and they ended up fighting back and forth for those for a while. But they never maintained the same greatness or same authority or same power that Alexander showed when he conquered the nations. Again, after this, we turn to what happens following Alexander. That's verses 5 through 20. We're going to take a look at verses 5 through 6, go through them kind of step by step, show you how history lines up with the prophecy. Again, Daniel wrote this long before it ever happened. Keep that in mind. To us, it's pretty simple and straightforward to look back in history and see how the prophecy lines up with our history. It's a little more harder when the history hasn't happened yet, as is in the case with the last part of the chapter. But it's still fascinating to see the accuracy and detail with which God can predict what would happen. And that's because of how things work in chapter 10, because we know that he calls the shots, and it's much the result of spiritual influence. Verse 5, Then the king of the south shall be strong, but one of his princes shall be stronger than he and shall rule, and his authority shall be a great authority. Again, starting to talk about the king of the south and the king of the north. As we read through history, we see that Ptolemy, who was the general under Alexander that ended up ruling in the south, that would be the area of Egypt, he helped Seleucus, who was another general of Alexander, and according to what I've read, he was kind of, I don't know if assistant is the right word, but they kind of cooperated, and maybe a mentor is a better term. He worked down in Egypt for a while, but they didn't like, or they decided to attack yet another general of Alexander's. Again, I said there was infighting, who was really ruling up towards the north. That would be the north of Israel, in the Babylonian Syrian area. So these two guys went up there, and they said, we're going to take over your area, Antigonus. And so they had a battle and fought. They won. Antigonus was driven out. It turns out that Seleucus stayed up in the north, in the Syrian area, while Ptolemy went back down to Egypt. And while he was up there, Seleucus took over the entire region and ended up coming to have more power on land than did Ptolemy in the south. So who used to be the assistant or the subordinate went up, took over the north, and he actually became greater than the king to the south, which is exactly what our prophecy said would happen. The next portion. After some years they shall make an alliance, and the daughter of the king of the south shall come to the king of the north and make an agreement. Again, history tells us that years later, and it says some years later, actually like a generation or generation and a half later, Ptolemy II, that would be the son of the original Ptolemy we talked about, gave his daughter Berenice to Antiochus II. Antiochus II was ruling up in Syria. He would be the grandson of Seleucus in the north. Everybody okay? Names, dates, but you see why we can't do this on a large scale for very long. We're going to do just this passage, and it's already... But it is still fascinating. Ptolemy II, son of the original, gave his daughter Berenice to Antiochus II, grandson of the original Seleucus in the north, as a political marriage to form an alliance. This was common to do back in the olden days, right? Two kingdoms say, hey, we want to get along as a way of sealing the deal. I'm going to give you my daughter to marry. That way, my daughter's up there. I'm less likely to attack. We're on friendly terms. Everybody's seen the Disney movies, right, where the princess goes to marry somebody else and everybody's happy. And see, which cartoon is that real big in? There's a couple of them, right? And I can't even think of which princess or whatever. Anyway, you know what I'm talking about. They swap kids, and so everybody's happy and they get along. That's the idea. And that's what happened. Antiochus then was forced, the king of the north, forced to divorce his first wife, Laodicea in order to do so. The only inconvenience with this arranged marriage was that the one guy was already married. But for the sake of the kingdom, we all know what happens. He sets aside his first wife so that he takes the wife of the Egyptian king so that the two kingdoms will get along. And the first wife, Laodicea, does that name sound familiar to anyone? I'm thinking, it sounds familiar, maybe Revelation or something like that, yeah. Mentioned elsewhere in the epistles too. Yeah, the king took another town and decided to name it after his lovely wife and called the town what? Laodicea. Yeah, that fits together pretty well, doesn't it? Yeah, the town that had plumbing problems because they are neither hot or cold, really. And we can't, I'm just kidding, it has nothing to do with plumbing. Lighten up, yeah. But this is where the name came from, right? From this wife of the king. Continue on. But she shall not retain the strength of her arm, and he and his arm shall not endure. But she shall be given up, and her attendants, he who fathered her, and he who supported her in those times. What in the world does that mean? Apparently arm, strength, talking about political power and influence. What actually happened in history is that only a couple years later after this arranged marriage took place, Ptolemy II, the king of the south in Egypt, died. Well, that causes problems to the political alliance, right? Now you have a new king. Maybe he will honor the treaty, maybe he won't, but kind of all bets are off at that point once one of the king dies. Well, once the alliance is gone, you no longer have any need for who? The girl. Sorry, girl, bye-bye, right? So the king in the north decides to get rid of his arranged marriage, Berenice, and take back the one that he really wanted to be with in the first place, Laodicea. Okay? So he got rid of Bernice, took back Laodicea. However, Laodicea turned out to be both hot and cold, right? In contrast to the city named after her. She was pretty ticked about this whole thing, about being divorced, kicked out, retaken back, used as however she felt. She was pretty upset about the whole thing. So in typical Greek drama style, what did she do? Well, what all the royalty do, right? You kill everybody you can, because that's what they did. And that's what she did. For revenge, Laodicea then decided to murder Bernice, who took her place for a couple years. And while she was at it, she also murdered the king, Antiochus II, the husband that did this to her, and also the young son that the two of them, Bernice and Antiochus, had to make sure that their son never took the throne as well, so she could put in one of her sons to be the ruling authority. Whew. And you wonder where Greek mythology gets all of its drama and its violence and its deceit and deception and manipulation. All they had to do is look at their own royalty, change the names and a couple details, and there you got your mythology, by the way, because that's how they behaved. Power-hungry, vicious people back then. Not good at all. But in these two verses, you can see how history completely reflects and fulfills the prophecy that was written by Daniel hundreds of years before. And again, if we were to do this verse by verse by verse all the way down, we could do that all the way down through the end of the section. Again, that's too much time, it's too much details, too much information to go through in this format. If you want to look through that at home, again, feel free to do that. It's fascinating stuff. But we're going to fast forward here. The next several verses, clear down through verse 20, continue to talk about the battles of these two kings. And if you remember when we had the map up a few weeks ago where we said the kingdom to the north and the kingdom to the south, they're fighting back and forth, and this army advances and that army advances, but stuck in the middle is a little town called what? Called Jerusalem, yeah. And no matter which army happens to be winning, as long as there's a battle going on, which there almost always was, Jerusalem loses because there was the battleground stuck in the middle. And so that's why Daniel probably focused on these things that he did, because it would affect his people, God's people, Israel. And God wanted them to know, yes, these hard times will come. Brace yourselves. Be prepared. Don't think that I've lost control. Don't think that I've forgotten about you. Don't think this caught me unawares. But you're going to be going through some hard times. And you're going to need to remember the sovereignty that I showed you in the first 10 chapters of this book to understand that I'm still in control, that I'm still calling the shots, even though things are bad. That brings us to same chapter, verse 21. Verse 20, let's start reading in verse 20. Then shall arise in his place, that would be in the place of the king that we just talked about before that we didn't actually read, one who shall send an exactor of tribute for the glory of the kingdom. But within a few days, by the way, there was another king that, yes, did that. He was starting to be taxed by Rome for his area. He didn't have the money to pay off Rome, and so he started taxing people super heavily. I think 1,000 talents of silver a year or something like that is what I read. And he didn't have the funds, and so he had to raise taxes enormously to pay off Rome, and that's what this verse is talking about. But within a few days he shall be broken, neither in anger nor in battle. Again, from what I read, the guy just we're not exactly sure what happened, but he just kind of disappears from the scene, probably murdered if the typical thing that happened back then happened. Verse 21, in his place shall arise a contemptible person to whom royal majesty has not been given. He shall come in without warning and obtain the kingdom by flatteries. Again, we're kind of shifting our focus now down to this last king. In the next several verses, verses 21 through 35, we'll kind of focus in on this one king, because from Israel's perspective, he's a big deal. So here's the verse we just read. In his place shall rise a contemptible person to whom royal majesty has not been given. He shall come in without warning and obtain the kingdom by flatteries. And sure enough, this guy, Antiochus IV Epiphanes, he came to power not in the normal way, but by posing as a guardian of the rightful heir. We just talked about the previous king who died kind of suddenly, mysteriously. He did have a couple of sons. One was off elsewhere in kingdom doing other things. And so the power was kind of left to his youngest son, who was too young to rule. Well, again, as we see in Bible history and other places, when you have a king that's rightful heir, but he's too young to rule, you have somebody step in and kind of mentor him or guide him or whatever. So this Antiochus Epiphanes decided, yes, this is a good way into power for me. And so he steps into power, kind of assumes the decision-making role while the young king is still growing up, right? And he starts to rule and reign, and he establishes his power by making treaties and deals with other countries around him, which he ends up double-crossing for the most part and betraying them, flatteries. Where am I at? Antiochus came to power, posing as guardian of the rightful heir. But when the rightful heir was killed, mysteriously, how would that happen? Probably orchestrated by Antiochus himself, so that he could assume the power. Antiochus, who on the slideshow I'm calling A4E, right? Antiochus IV Epiphanes, shorter to right. He assumed the throne. So this guy comes in, he says, oh, I will take care of the king while he's growing up, but I will assume power in the meantime. He assumes the power, he establishes himself, he has the young son killed, now he is the king. He assumes the rule by flatteries and by deception. The next portion says, armies shall be utterly swept away before him and broken, even the prince of the covenant. And sure enough, Antiochus attacked several armies with success for a little while anyway, including Egypt. He also, as a means of trying to control Jerusalem and the Jews, he had the high priest of the Jews in Jerusalem, Onias, killed in alliance with Onias' own brother, Menelaus, who was in cooperation with Antiochus. Antiochus said, I want to rule with an iron fist everybody, and the way to rule Jerusalem right now is probably with their highest ranking official, or the most respected official, which would be the high priest. So I need a high priest in here who's going to side and rule with me to do what I say, right? Who's going to do what I tell him to do. And so the high priest at the time, Onias, was a good man, from what I understand. He had integrity, he was a good priest, but his brother was not so much. So Antiochus and the brother, who was Menelaus, they came up with a little coercion, and Menelaus killed off his brother so he could then be installed as high priest by Antiochus. And now, sure enough, Israel, as far as the ruling high priest, is now on his side, because he wants to make everybody Grecian and get rid of the Jewish custom so that they'll be more faithful to him. Isn't that slick? Isn't that a good idea? You think our government is corrupt. You've seen nothing yet, right? Continuing on. And from the time that an alliance is made with him who shall act deceitfully, and he shall become strong with a small people. Antiochus then assisted the transition of power in Egypt. Again, he was very manipulative, And so he says, all right, there's a transition going down here in Egypt. I'm going to pick the guy who I think is going to be the winner, and I'm going to side with him and help him along, right? Then when he comes to power, what happens? He's going to be friendly towards me and help me out, right? So he assisted the transition of power in Egypt, which gained him favor. But soon he decided to turn around and then double-cross this young ruler, who is probably not real strong or established yet, and he attacked several of the unsuspecting areas of Egypt and kind of took them over. He double-crossed it. This type of thing, again, goes on and on and on. We just don't have time this morning or the mental capacity to absorb it all. We're going to skip down kind of towards the end of this section, towards verse 31, and pick up a few verses there before we transition. Verse 31 says, "Forces from him shall appear and profane the temple and the fortress," it's still talking about Antiochus, "and shall take away the regular burnt offering, and they shall set up the abomination that makes desolate." Again, from history we know, Antiochus came to Jerusalem, and he killed thousands of Jews. Apparently, he suffered a military defeat in Egypt. He got really angry and decided to take it out on Jerusalem. So he came back. He killed thousands of the Jews. He also criminalized Jewish customs. He offered swine on the altar and then installed an altar to a pagan altar, probably Jupiter or Zeus, whatever you want to call him, in the temple, either in place of the original altar or even on top of it, as we read in Maccabees a few weeks ago, which is a complete desecration of the temple to the holy God. So much so that the faithful Jews wouldn't even come to the temple anymore because it was no longer a temple to their God. He had turned it into a temple to the pagan deities. The abomination that causes desolation. Continuing on, "He shall seduce with flattery those who violate the covenant. But the people who know their God shall stand firm and take action." Antiochus, in trying to gain power and rule and authority in this area, of course, what do? You offer safety and reward to the Jews who had abandoned Judaism. He comes in and says, you're not going to worship your God anymore. You're going to worship my gods. You're not going to live as Jewish people anymore. You're going to live as Greeks like I am. That way we're all going to be the same. We're all going to be unified, and things will get along much better. Some of the Jews, remember, said, yes, this sounds like a good idea. We're tired of being persecuted. We're tired of being weirdos in the kingdom. And so we're just going to surrender and become Greeks. And we're going to abandon all of God's laws. We're going to abandon circumcision, the sacrifices, the temple, the worship, everything. Just forget it all. We're done. We're going to go be Greeks now. And I did verify. I did relook it up after somebody asked me about it. According to what we can tell, this would be the groups that we would later start to call in the New Testament the Sadducees, yeah. They are the Hellenized Jews, the ones that abandoned their Jewishness and became Greeks. And so we see in the New Testament where, in a passage where it says where the Sadducees believe neither in the afterlife or the angels or anything like that. Well, now it makes sense why. And the Pharisees, who are the religious conservatives, right? Remember, like Paul and stuff, observing the law and to the nth degree of all the different rituals and stuff. And the Sadducees did not get along. They hated each other, except in one particular point. Their combined hatred of the Messiah, of Jesus. That's the one point where they can get along. So where you see Jesus arguing with the Sadducees and the Pharisees, you read it and it sounds like these two guys are kind of buddies and they're getting along and they're all ganging up on Jesus. Well, they are all ganging up on Jesus, but in normal life they hated each other. In fact, Paul used this to his advantage once when he was under arrest, remember? And he said, this whole big deal, because they were standing before the Roman governor, and Paul says, this whole thing is this whole thing because I've talked about the vision that I had of the afterlife. And he knows that half of his accusers are Pharisees and half are Sadducees. Beautiful move. I love this. It's so funny. And they forgot about Paul for a minute, and they started arguing back and forth against each other. Well, maybe this guy did see something. No, he didn't see something. There is no afterlife. There's no spiritual. Yes, there is. No, there isn't. And they start fighting against each other, and poor Paul, he's standing there smiling, saying, morons. And then the Roman ruler says, all right, you guys clearly don't know what you're talking about. And then the trial moves on. We don't have time for that this morning. But they're at odds with each other. Whew, that was a rabbit trail, wasn't it? Where was I at? I can't even tell. Oh, yeah, okay. So Antiochus, he offers safety and reward to the Jews who abandoned Judaism, but some resisted and fought. Again, some of them said, no, we are going to be faithful to the God of the temple, the God of Israel. And so there started kind of a subculture, a mini revolt, which we recognize as being led primarily by one family called the Maccabees, right? And they started staging what started out as a very small revolt, kind of the one guy killing another guy, and then the movement grew, and it became a pretty big movement for a while. It didn't last for super long, but they did have some success, and that's where the Jews get the holiday of Hanukkah. Yeah, you bet. Yeah, celebration of basically repurifying the temple is what it really is, and the candlelight burning for longer than it should have, and all that kind of thing. Anyway, to continue on. And the wise among the people shall make many understand, though for some days they shall stumble by sword and by flame, by captivity and plunder. And when they stumble, they shall receive a little help, and many shall join themselves to them with flattery. Sure enough, the Maccabees and the faithful Jews did fight Antiochus, and many Jews were killed. He just slaughtered thousands and thousands of them. However, seeing the success that they did have and several military victories that the Maccabees did have, other groups apparently did come to their aid, kind of like fair weather friends, right? We're going to help you out as long as it seems like you're succeeding, but if things turn against you, we'll probably duck and cover and abandon you pretty quick. And that's what happened. Although they didn't all join out of sincere devotion to the God of Israel. It's more of a political move in many cases. But they did receive some assistance from them. And again, that's exactly what Daniel wrote about would happen back in his book. That brings us to verse 35. And we said the portion that dedicates itself to Antiochus kind of goes through this verse. It says, "And some of the wise shall stumble, so that they may be refined, purified, and made white, until the time of the end, for it still awaits the appointed time." And this is kind of an odd phrase. So far, we've been going point by point by point of what would happen through what is now our history. Of course, there's future to Daniel in the intertestamental times. And we get to this portion of verse 35, and all of a sudden it says, "Until the time of the end, for it awaits the appointed time." We've not really seen that phrase pop up in this chapter yet. And that tells me, wait a minute, we're transitioning here somewhere. All right, a transition in time, a shift in time and identity. And again, what we see here is this is where, as is so common in prophecy, as they're so notorious for doing, there's big time gaps here and there that aren't really elaborated on in the verse, but we can see there's a gap, and all of a sudden we're kind of morphing or changing or shifting into a different mindset and a different time era. Sure enough, from here on out, we kind of start focusing on another Antiochus, if you want to call him that, a bigger one, what we like to call the Antichrist in verses 36 through 45. The reason we say that is for two reasons. One, the characteristics of the Antichrist seem to be bigger and bolder and more extravagant even than what Antiochus was. But even more so far in the chapter, we've been able to pretty much plug and play historical fact to prophecy, right? Here's what Daniel said, here's how it played out. Here's what Daniel said, here's how it played out. From here on, we don't seem to get those kind of good matches in history. And it becomes really difficult to plug and play throughout history probably because that history hasn't happened yet. And so we don't see that one-to-one correlation that we have so far. So take a look at chapter 11, verse 36. "And the king shall do as he wills." The king being not Antiochus anymore. We're talking about the ruler to come, right? "The king will do as he wills. He shall exalt himself and magnify himself above every god, and he shall speak astonishing things against the God of gods. He shall prosper until the indignation is accomplished." Is accomplished. What does that mean? I mean, in simple terms, what is accomplished? There is a set task that must be performed, and then it will be accomplished. Who assigns the assigned task? Come on, you know the answer. We've been through the whole book of Daniel. Who puts them up? Who sets them down? Who declares the times to come? Who does it? God has assigned the task. He says, this is what you will do. Who's in control? The God of Daniel, the God of Israel. Right. Continuing on. "For what is decreed shall be done." Decreed by who? Yes, God, right? "Until it is done." Define done. The job that is assigned. Who assigned? God. What is this verse clearly saying? This guy will take charge for a while as long as he does what God has prescribed for him to do. So really God's in charge. He's the ultimate authority. Totally consistent with the rest of the book. This is why we need the first portion of the book before we get to this one, right? Because he's established his authority. "He shall pay no attention to the gods of his fathers or to the one beloved by women. This phrase, the gods of his fathers, this is what some people use to say, the Antichrist must be Jewish, because the God of his fathers is a common theme throughout the Old Testament, talking about the gods of the Jews. According to what I've read and the way I personally interpret, it could be that, or maybe not. It just says it doesn't use the word Yahweh for God. It just says the gods, the Elohims. Could talk about the false gods, could talk about the true God. Whatever it is, Jewish or Gentile, this guy goes above and beyond any idolatry that we've seen so far. Nebuchadnezzar, remember, what did he say? You will come here and you will worship my God. Or any, the Greeks come in. Antiochus comes in. You're not going to worship your God, you're going to worship my gods. This guy goes above and beyond that. He says, I'm going to disregard all of your false gods. I am going to be the God, right? Way above and beyond in his idolatry. Or to the one beloved by women. Honestly, I'm not sure what that means. The opinions on that are so far scattered, I'm not going to even offer them up. So you'll have to figure that one out for yourself. Good luck. He shall not pay any attention to any other god, for he shall magnify himself above all. Again, he's not going to worry or even waste time on false gods, other than himself, right? He will assign himself to be the God. And it's fascinating to me, again, not trying to assign one-to-one anything here, but what does that take for that to happen? Really, you have to abandon all religion, right? All the other God, all the other theocracy systems, whatever you call them, and make yourself the God. What does that sound like? It sounds like you are a what? A secular humanist. What in the world do we see going on rampant today? Atheism is skyrocketing off. We no longer worry about which God do you serve, right? Do you believe in a God is the question these days, right? I saw another survey the other day about how atheism is skyrocketing while Christianity and all the religions are kind of dwindling off. With our scientific achievements and accomplishments and this and that, we are becoming our own gods. And man, it sure fits in here, because this guy has no God beyond himself. And he's the ultimate secular humanist that we see developing in our society today. At the end of time, the king of the south shall attack him, but the king of the north shall rush upon him like a whirlwind, chariots and horsemen with many ships, and he shall come into the glorious land, and tens of thousands shall fall, yet he shall come to his end with none to help him. He has all this power, he's done all these things, he's all magnificent, but his kingdom is not real stable. There's a lot of infighting, there's a lot of strife, and so the king of the south and king of the north, they kind of come and try to attack him. Dissension within the ranks, right? The rule of this arrogant ruler fragments and breaks apart with internal conflict, almost like it's really, how would you describe it, a really brittle type of alliance, almost brittle like what? Clay. Does that sound familiar? Strength of iron, the brutality of iron, but mixed with the brittleness of clay, so it doesn't adhere well and it falls apart easily. And that's exactly what we see going on here. He conquers with brutality and rules with brutality and strength and viciousness, but he can't keep the alliance together because there's too much anger, too much dissension, and it starts to fall apart like iron and clay mixed together. At that time shall arise Michael, the great prince who has charge of your people. There shall be a time of trouble such as never been seen. Since there has never been in the nation until that time. But at that time your people shall be delivered, everyone whose name shall be found written in the book. And we're starting to get into chapter 12 here. Don't let that bother you. The two chapters meld together. When all seems lost, Michael and the return of Christ will come to destroy the ruler and to rescue the righteous. When all seems lost and everything is hopeless and Israel is destroyed, talks about Israel's power shaken, destroyed. It looks like they're going to be wiped out for sure. Who comes in to save the day? Michael, the archangel. Of course, we know the return of Christ is the true driving power behind that. And they come and they rescue Israel, the faithful followers who are resisting the Antichrist, but they're being beaten down and killed and destroyed. And like I said, when all else fails and everybody's ganged up against them, Christ swoops in and saves the day, and he takes on the armies of the world and destroys them. Daniel at this point turns around and he starts talking back to the angels there. He says, how long shall it be until the end of these wonders? This is chapter 12, verse 5, by the way. Again, we had to skip a few verses. How long shall it be till the end of these wonders? And I heard the man clothed in linen, who was above the waters of the stream. He raised his right hand and his left towards heaven, and swore by him who lives forever that it would be for times and half a time. and that when the shattering of the power of the holy people comes to an end, all these things would be finished. And it's going to come to that, and the bad guys are going to just all but destroy Israel. And it would have if God had not cut the time short, Revelation tells us. But when their power is gone and they're barely hanging on, these things will finally be finished. God will put an end to it, and he'll restore righteousness. So here's another reference to the 3.5 years that we see elsewhere in Daniel and Revelation. Verse 11, from the time that the regular burnt offering is taken away under the Antichrist, the abomination that makes desolation is set up, there shall be 1,290 days. Blessed is he who waits and arrives at the 1,335 days. But go your way to the end, and you shall rest and stand in your allotted place at the end of the days. So he gives hope at the end, not all will be lost. Kind of some curiosity about the numbers of days there, right? 3.5 years comes out to 1,260 days. But he says, from the time this happens to that happens, there shall be 1,290 days. That's 30 extra days. There's speculation in the commentaries. Again, whenever I see speculation, I look for backing or reasoning behind it. How do you support your speculation? There wasn't a whole lot. The Bible doesn't really specify. The best guess that I saw was the 1,290 days. That's the 3.5 years, plus 30 days probably maybe to execute judgment and carry out justice. After all, this is cleaned up, right? Christ comes in, he takes down the bad guys, but the bad guys still need to be sentenced, essentially, and justice needs to be done. Maybe that'll take 30 days. Is that a rock solid, that's what's going to happen? I'm not that confident. I'm pretty conservative when I come to this stuff, so I'm not going to take a guess and say this is what it is. I don't know, but that sounds like the best guess I've heard, so I'll suggest it to you and leave it in your court. And then it says, blessed are you if you make it to the 1,335 days. Again, 3.5 years plus 75 days rule, obviously 30 of that to execute judgment, another 45 to set up his millennial government and administration. Maybe. Again, I will not be dogmatic on that, but whatever happens, at the end of that 1335, he says, blessed are you if you arrive at that time, which, again, after that sounds like something great happens, which I would assume to be the millennial reign. So that makes sense. We are just about out of time. I do want to wrap up Daniel with this. Question. Why would Daniel give visions that would happen long after his people time? What is the point of all this prophecy, in other words? Daniel and everybody that read this firsthand would be long gone. This answers the question of what would happen in the future, but again, why does he do that? There's some things he answers, but there's a lot of stuff he skips too. Is it just to satisfy people's curiosity of what would happen, so that as they're in the checkout line of the supermarket, they can pick up the tabloid and see what will be like in the end times? Everybody's seen those, right? About every other week they come out with another Nostradamus prediction, even though he's been dead for like however many hundred years. To satisfy people's curiosity, I think there's more to it than that, right? Because there's a lot of questions he doesn't answer. Let me answer the question with another question. Why would God give us revelations in the New Testament that happens long after many of the New Testament believers' time? And maybe our time. Personally, I think it's coming sooner rather than later, but I could be wrong. Why give us revelation? Why give the Old Testament people the book of Daniel? Why predict the future in this way? To satisfy our curiosity, so that we know what's coming, so we can brace for it, so we can buy generators and stash food away for when the bad times come. I think it's more than that. I think so. Again, we emphasize what we saw before. Until the appointed time, or until the time of the appointed end, or until he has accomplished what he is to accomplish. What is this whole scenario telling you? You remember what Isaiah said several times throughout his book. Look around you. Find to me a false god that can tell you what is to come and then make it pass. Nobody can do that except for who? Except for me. There is no other God besides me. I'm the one that sets up. I'm the one that takes down. I'm the one that calls the shots. Even the bad guys, I am the one that assigns their task and their times. I am the one who does it. So God encourages us that even though difficulty is to come, he is ultimately in charge, and he will win, and he will rule when all is said and done at the time that he has appointed. That's the same lesson that we take away from the book of Daniel today, as well as from the book of Revelation. Bad news, everybody. Tough times will come. Hopefully we as believers, of course, will not be here for the future bad times to come if our understanding of eschatology is correct. We will not be here on this planet any longer, but bad times will come. Wars, rumors of wars, but the time is not yet here. So when bad times come, who calls the shots? when good times comes, who calls the shots? Who's really in charge and who knows how things will play out? That should be an encouragement to us. So when bad things happen, which they always do, God's still in charge. Take heart. Be brave. Stick it out. You're on the winning side. Let's pray and we'll dismiss. Dear God, we thank you this morning for this week and this whole quarter. We can go through this extraordinary book of Daniel where above and beyond all else, you establish your authority and your sovereignty. We don't need to worry about world events. We don't need to worry about bad guys in power. We don't need to worry about the destruction of society and everything that we tend to fret about around us, because we know that you're calling the shots. You assign tasks to good people and tasks to bad people. You're in charge of them all. You tell them when they can rule and when they cannot. Help us to keep that in mind. Don't let us panic. Don't let us flip out about every headline that we see coming across the news wires, because we know that you're in charge. You know what's going on, and you'll work it all out in the end. We know it could be a bumpy ride in the middle. We pray for faithfulness on our part, that we would all serve you regardless of who's in charge. But help us to keep that in perspective. In Jesus' name I pray, amen.